Ukraine's Leopard 1A5 tanks look nothing like they did when Germany sent them. Once dismissed as outdated Cold War relics, they've now been transformed into something strange and unexpectedly effective. They're not just tanks anymore, they're sniper platforms, drone hunters, and even experimental anti-aircraft systems, customized in ways no army's ever tried. And after years in combat, these Franken tanks are surviving better than many modern Western vehicles. Instead of fighting as traditional main battle tanks, Ukraine's Leopard 1As have been transformed into something completely different. They function as armored snipers that can accurately engage targets beyond traditional tank visual reaches, experimental drone hunting platforms and automated turret testers, and even possible anti-aircraft weapon systems. Ukrainian engineers and Western innovation have upgraded a tank that 9 other countries in the world currently have, and none of them are in Western Europe. But to understand why Ukraine's Leopard modifications represent such a radical departure from conventional tank warfare, we need to examine how these 60-year-old machines are rewriting the rules of modern armored combat. The Leopard 1A5 was never supposed to fight in Ukraine. When Germany approved the export of 178 of these tanks in early 2023, it was essentially clearing out local storage facilities. The Leopard 1 had been retired from frontline service across Europe since the early 2000s, replaced by the far more capable Leopard 2 series. These tanks eventually entered legal limbo as they were roughly split between Rheinmetall and FFG, 2 German military weapon and vehicle manufacturers and suppliers, and a portion of Rheinmetall's stock was in Switzerland, which initially contested sending Western weapons to Ukraine. However, Germany, Denmark and the Netherlands would then go on to pledge to send at least 100 of these tanks anyway. Rheinmetall would later announce a potential deal to purchase tanks from Italy, which also hit a few snags before being reduced to only 25 units. The initial batches of Leopard tanks were only delivered 19 months later in early September 2024, sporting an updated look after delays to make sure that shelved equipment was actually in working order. Yet within months of arrival, these tanks began consistently outperforming expectations against Russian forces while suffering lower than predicted losses. Out of 103 tanks that are currently in service as of August 2025, 21 of them have been hit, destroyed or abandoned. According to Ukraine's 508th Separate Repair and Restoration Battalion, which handles damaged armored vehicles, these losses are acceptable. When put into more numbers, it's a survival rate of roughly 87%, better than many modern Western tanks fighting in the same conditions. The 508th went on to say that there are reasons to believe that they are being used properly, praising the 7 brigades that were fielding the tank by May 2025. But the reasons for this success lies in what Ukraine did after the tanks were delivered. While the tanks would have likely sported an abysmal survival rate had they simply gone from transport to front line, Ukrainian engineers retrofitted and modernized them to fight a war they were never really designed for in the first place. The Leopard 1A5's fundamental weakness in modern times was definitely its thin armor, maxing out at just 70mm thick on the front. This would have been enough to stop small arms of up to 20mm in caliber, but not enough to survive a hit from Cold War-era 125mm used by its Soviet counterpart, the T-64, let alone actual armor-piercing munitions. Additionally, the prevalence of explosive ordnance on both sides of the conflict, mainly those dropped by small drones or loitering munitions like the Zala Lancet, meant that tanks were relatively slow-moving targets in the grand picture of modern warfare. At the same time, a Leopard 1A weighs only around 40 tons, compared to over 60 tons that the modernized Leopard 2A models have. As such, it's a relatively maneuverable main battle tank designed to accelerate rapidly over flat surfaces and have better off-road handling. For Ukraine, where roads quickly become a liability due to the increasing presence of both short and long-range surveillance, the last part was pivotal. Having tanks that could more easily handle swampy terrain was more important to preserve than overhauling the entire armor system to be heavier. This forced Ukrainian engineers to think differently about tank protection. Rather than trying to make the tank bulletproof, they made it drone-proof. Ukrainian specialists have locally integrated advanced armor packages, including Contact 1 and Nij Explosive Reactive Armor, or ERA, onto the Leopard 1A5s. However, these ERAs were technically designed for a different kind of tank, namely the T-64 and its derivatives, which have a slightly different chassis shape. This meant Ukrainian engineers needed to go back to the drawing board to design proper ERA placement around the tank. The solution involved the strategic placement of ERA blocks across the most vulnerable surfaces. Contact 1 reactive armor, originally developed in the Soviet Union, consists of explosive-filled boxes that detonate upon impact with shaped charges, effectively rerouting the explosive energy away from the tank to minimize the damage and prevent the charge from penetrating the armor. According to its manufacturers, Contact 1 can reduce the penetration capability of a standard anti-tank rocket by up to 92% and tank-fired heat rounds by 52%. While these statistics are likely dated, as they were tested against weapons made around the same time as the first tanks with the system were unveiled in the late 1980s, the actual structure of ordnances didn't change that much. Ukraine and Russia also both rely on reusing their existing stocks of Soviet-era weapons and munitions for as long as possible, making anti-tank mines from the 1960s a relatively common sight on a 2020s front line. The Nij, on the other hand, features a non-linear, multi-layered design of internal shaped charges stacked against one another. When triggered by an incoming charge or even a kinetic penetrator, the charges detonate, with one detonation causing a chain reaction of neighboring charges. This energy creates a sequence of so-called knives, which cut into and destroy the munition above. Nij also has smaller modules overall, which improve the tank's resilience against getting hit multiple times and from different directions and angles. However, the entire armor system is slightly less effective against larger ordnance at the expense of providing protection against kinetic penetrators, which Contact 1 doesn't cover at all. Perhaps most importantly, Ukrainians developed comprehensive and dedicated anti-drone protection systems beyond providing the tanks with anti-explosive armor. Ukrainian media footage shows a deployable grille that folds over the back of the turret, as if it were the hood of a convertible. These cope cages are complemented by mesh netting designed to trap incoming FPV drones before they can detonate against the hull, reducing the explosive's energy by wasting it on air. This improvised armor proved its worth in spectacular fashion. One such Ukrainian Leopard 1A5 survived at least 10 drone strikes, with 3 hits to the frontal part, as well as 2 more to the left side and rear of the hull, before eventually being disabled after taking a total of 11 drone strikes. While the armor modifications grabbed headlines, Ukraine's most significant innovation was tactical. Instead of using the Leopard 1 as a main battle tank, for which it was originally built in the Cold War, it transformed it into a precision mid-range weapon system. The 508th Separate Repair and Restoration Battalion describes the Leopard 1A5V as working best as a mobile sniper tank, but noting that a well-trained crew can fire 10 rounds per minute while its Russian opponents fire 6 to 10 rounds. This allows the tank to lie in wait until a large target is located, then scurry to within range, which is around 2.5 to 3 miles, and rapidly shoot its current loadout of munitions before driving away. This is done for 2 reasons. The tank's 105mm Royal Ordnance L7A3 gun, originally designed in the 1960s, is technically considered outdated by modern tank turret standards when it comes to caliber size and munitions compatibility, as NATO uses 120mm cannons on all tanks nowadays. However, it's also proven surprisingly effective when combined with modern ammunition and fire control systems such as laser rangefinders and thermal imaging, which have advanced significantly since the tank's inception and were essentially bottlenecking the gun's accuracy and efficiency. Secondly, the previous sentiment about the lack of armor makes the hit-and-run tactics much more logical. Without armor to protect itself from artillery strikes, which is arguably one of Russia's fortes as it produces more artillery munitions than the entirety of NATO combined, according to NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, announcing itself in a prolonged strike will be tantamount to suicide. This is why Leopard 1 crews use only a limited number of munitions stored in the turret itself, with the rest of them kept inside the crew space. When the current arsenal runs out, the tank retreats to a safer space and the crew reloads the turret. This also minimizes the potential damage done to the tank in case of an enemy hitting it. Every round in the turret is a potential explosive charge that can be detonated and destroy the tank from the inside out, which is a tactic used by Ukrainian drone crews to destroy the autoloader carrying T-72s and later models. The tank's lightweight design also gives it a crucial mobility advantage. Its MTU MB838CA M500 engine delivers 830 horsepower, providing a power-to-weight ratio of nearly 20 horsepower per ton. This allows the tank to accelerate quickly from concealed positions, fire with precision, and withdraw before Russian counter-battery fire can respond. Ukrainian crews have used this capability in close-quarters combat as well. When Russian infantry seized a position east of Pokrovsk, one of the Leopard 1A5s left its hideout to blast the Russians with a 105mm shell fired at point-blank range. However, it's not only Ukraine that has done some tinkering to improve the Leopard's odds when stacked against modern armor, drones, and long-range strikes. Belgium has tried to go in a completely different direction. Rather than improving the tank's survivability or armaments directly, it aims to reduce the tank's weight and increase accuracy through an unmanned turret. More specifically, it's testing out the Leopard 1A5 fitted with the Cockerill 3105 unmanned turret system. The Cockerill 3105 turret combines a NATO standard 105mm main gun with advanced sensors and an autoloader system in a lightweight aluminium housing. This configuration reduces crew requirements from 4 to 3, divesting the position of the leader, essentially reverting it to what Ukrainians were used to with their Soviet-designed tanks, which also have an autoloader. Furthermore, using the 105mm gun allows the tank to also launch the Phalaric 105 laser-guided anti-tank missile, which broadens the vehicle's potential use cases or cements its position as a sniper-like tank hunter. The lighter housing and reduction in crew complements have been suggested to reduce the weight of the tank by about 5 tons, which is a massive 1/8 of the total weight. This could reduce the strain on the aging chassis, which are arguably the most difficult to repair to perfect working conditions. The Cockerel also has more weapons control and awareness features, such as smoke canister dispensers and a smart gunfire detection system. These can drastically improve the crew's survivability by alerting them to possible threats and allowing for more diversionary tactics to fool first-person view drones that rely on clear vision indicators for engagement. Additionally, the turret being unmanned and seating the crew members below it has additional survivability benefits. Even a direct hit that destroys the turret could leave the crew alive in the hull's protected compartment. This also addresses one of the Leopard 1A5's key limitations in ammunition storage. Traditional tanks store ready-use ammunition in the turret for rapid reloading. With an unmanned turret and autoloader, ammunition can be stored in the hull's most protected areas, reducing the risk of catastrophic explosions. Having the ability to store more munitions more securely plays directly into Ukraine's existing use of the Leopard 1 as a mid-range skirmisher rather than a direct main battle tank. A video showcase of the turret indicates that mounting it on an existing Leopard chassis requires minimal modifications, with an added adapter ring between the chassis and the turret to suit its bearing and a set of cables to provide power to the turret and relay information to the driver. The adapter ring itself could potentially be a target for enemy drones, given that it cleanly separates the turret from the chassis. However, given that the tank itself is not readily designed to survive major hits from dedicated anti-tank rounds, it's largely a non-issue if Ukraine uses it as it did with the current batch of Leopards it has. Of course, the Belgian modification is still undergoing trials, but its potential deployment to Ukraine could be the field test that influences whether older tank designs like the Leopard 1 still have a place in modern warfare, or if they're working on borrowed time and need the same suite of modifications and tactical changes. Perhaps the strangest evolution of Ukraine's Leopard program involves converting the tank chassis into dedicated anti-aircraft platforms. Germany's Rheinmetall has done that by developing the Skyranger 35 air defense system. The Skyranger 35 system features a 35mm autocannon in an unmanned turret, with the manufacturer suggesting it can carry a total ammunition load of 252 rounds. The autocannon is supposed to have an effective range against aerial targets of up to 2.5 miles. If this sounds familiar, that's because it's evocative of the German Leopard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which itself was a derivative of the Leopard 1 chassis to allow it to keep in touch with the main tank formation. This system addresses Ukraine's desperate need for mobile air defense against Russian drone swarms. While systems like the Patriot excel against high-investment ballistic missiles, they're economically inefficient against cheap drones, even including the more advanced, long-range models like the Shahed 136 and its derivatives. The combination of a Skyranger 35 on a Leopard 1 chassis offers the mobility to keep pace with advancing Ukrainian forces while providing dedicated anti-drone capability. To increase the system's use cases, the turret also accepts shorter-range air defense systems such as the twin launcher for FIM-92 Stinger or Mistral missiles. These are notable because they are already used by Ukraine in other dedicated or prototyped anti-air systems, making them readily available should the system actually get deployed. However, despite the unveiling of the system back in June 2024, there have been no confirmed public updates regarding the system or its potential use in Ukraine. Rheinmetall is still likely field testing the Frankenstein Leopard 1s, but doing it on native NATO soil and could be ready to start manufacturing or delivery as soon as Ukraine places an order. What ties these Ukrainian Leopard 1 modifications together and makes them either so effective or potentially lucrative for future use is much more than just modernizing the tank. Instead, it's making the tank more optimized for current battlefield conditions. One of the key modifications done by both Germany and Ukraine when delivering the tanks was to introduce the EMES-18 fire control system, itself derived from the more advanced Leopard 2. The new fire control includes advanced night vision capabilities, allowing it to function similarly to its modern Western cousins in search and destroy missions. For a tank that has practically no armor against modern 125mm rounds, the ability to see the enemy and strike first is likely a core component of its potential battlefield viability. Additionally, unlike the sophisticated but fragile systems in modern Western tanks, the Leopard 1A5's components can be maintained by Ukrainian crews with basic tools. A German defense attaché noted that the Leopard 2 is complex to maintain, particularly its sophisticated fire control system and powerful V12 twin-turbo diesel engine. These typically require specialist tools and crew, which are unlikely to be found near the front line. Damaged Leopard 2 tanks also often need to be transported to specialized repair facilities in western Ukraine or even Poland for maintenance, while Leopard 1A5s can be repaired much closer to the front lines. The Leopard 2 is also much more suited for the type of war NATO prefers, one where the alliance has an overwhelming aerial support and practical air superiority. In the war in Ukraine, it could be said that neither side rules the skies, and without air support, much of the Leopard 2's benefits in long-range combat are lost, making it a more expensive, heavier, and more foreign vehicle for the Ukrainian army to maintain. Sergei Sumleny, managing director of the Berlin-based European Resilience Initiative Center, has gone so far as to say that the Leopard 2 tanks were designed by a generation of German manufacturers that hadn't seen war and so tended to overcomplicate the system. What is particularly telling of the Leopard 1's success is how many of them were sent by the West. With around 100 units in use, the Leopard 1 is arguably the most numerous Western tank being used in the battle. When combining all donations from NATO, Ukraine has around 80 Leopard 2s, across various versions from 2A4 to 2A6, which is a paltry number all things considered. If a few tanks need repairs and they also need to be transported far away from the front, it's a notable portion of the tank attachment being lost. And the American tanks seem to be even worse off. Ukraine had already lost 27 out of 31 Abrams tanks it received from the US, mainly due to the fact that they were a nightmare to maintain and refuel and didn't have any drone protection themselves, while being difficult to retrofit compared to German models. These numbers provide further evidence on why Leopard 1 seems to be the winner in terms of Western tank donations. With countries like Germany, Poland, and Italy pulling the tanks from their stock of obsolete supplies, they can afford to send more of them as they're writing them off from active service. The success of Ukraine's Leopard 1A5 modifications revealed fundamental flaws in contemporary tank design philosophy. Modern main battle tanks prioritize maximum individual capability, with thicker armor, larger guns, and more sophisticated electronics. But this approach fails when facing swarms of cheap drones that can attack from above. This has created a new era where tanks need to be hidden in dugouts and used as artillery complements rather than a tool to mow down opposing infantry and tanks and press forward. In this environment, cheaper, lighter, and simpler to maintain proves to be much more valuable. Additionally, while the Leopard 1's cannon is slightly smaller, it's still enough to put other armored vehicles out of commission on a direct hit, which is only made more possible by integrating surveillance and fire control technology, which doesn't depend on the tank chassis nearly as much as physical characteristics such as armor, engine class, or equipment compatibility do. Despite this success, it's important to note that Ukraine's Leopard modifications are still facing significant limitations. The added armor weight through the incorporated era reduces the tank's original mobility advantage, and the protective systems require constant maintenance in field conditions. This can be particularly debilitating in urban warfare, where tanks would be inevitably forced into action as part of long-lasting defensive campaigns. The modifications are also technically one-time improvements. Unlike purpose-built modern tanks with upgrade paths built into their design, the Leopard 1A5's 1960s architecture limits how much you can add onto it before the chassis and engine simply fail to carry the load. The alternative pathways in Belgium and Rheinmetall's modification can help prolong the tank's lifespan, but they may not really be considered the Leopard 1 anymore. In the end, Ukraine's Leopard tanks are strange because they had to be. Conventional tank doctrine that rang true for the 20th century battlefields has been turned on its head in the age of drones. Ukrainian engineers responded by creating hybrid systems optimized for actual combat conditions rather than theoretical scenarios, and Western allies increasingly looked on, reaffirming that experimentation. And whether Ukraine's strange Leopards represent the future of armored warfare or simply a unique response to exceptional circumstances remains to be seen. But their success demonstrates exactly how Ukraine has been able to survive a war that has lasted for over 3.5 years, when everyone thought it would be over in a couple of weeks. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to learn more about how Western tanks have performed in Ukraine overall, check out this video. Or to stay up to date with the most recent developments in the war in Ukraine and global geopolitics, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.